Hello and welcome to the next in the series, Genesis, the first 3 chapters. After the creation of humanity, towards the end of chapter 1, we see that God is not just a creator, but a sustainer as well. He makes provision for humanity. And so in the last 2 verses of that chapter, we get these statements. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they'll be yours for food. Again, I give you every green plant for food. Now, there's an interesting later development. Following the flood epic in chapters 6 to 8, we find that God says in chapter 9, everything that lives and moves along the ground will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, now I give you everything. So this herbivorous provision at the end of chapter 1 now includes a carnivorous provision. Everything. Has God changed his mind? Well, no, but we see evidence in the scriptures that God bends to accommodate sinful humanity. He doesn't change his mind, and he makes provision throughout the scriptures for our redemption, but we find that he makes provision for us, for our weakness. He hasn't changed his mind concerning that and seeks to redeem us all. There's an example, for instance, in Matthew chapter 19, when Jesus speaks about the provision Moses made for sinful humanity with respect to divorce. God hasn't changed his mind, but he bends to accommodate our weakness. He still wants to redeem the whole of humanity and all those fallen states. Going back to the Genesis account, there are those who will argue in favour of vegetarianism or veganism. And they might use in their arguments that it's beneficial for us, there are health benefits. Or they might argue that it's pragmatic. You get so much more out of a crop in a field than you would out of animals. They might do it from ideological point of view. But what you cannot do is argue from a theological point of view that we must be vegan or we must be vegetarian. After all, Jesus ate fish and he pressed others to eat with him. And if you look at all the sacrifices commissioned in the Old Testament, they included the sacrifice of animals. Take, for instance, the Passover. It involved consuming a whole lamb. And you might remember in Acts chapter 10, when God was trying to persuade this reticent disciple, Peter, to leave behind his xenophobic attitudes to non-Jews, he was given this vision of all the animals in this big canopy, and he was given this instruction, up, Peter, kill and eat. Back then to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 30. I give you every green plant for food. So God creates and God makes provision for sustaining us. If we go to the Lord's Prayer, whether you read it in Matthew or in Luke, you'll find that a good 15 to 20% of that very short prayer has to do with petitioning God for particular needs, including give us our daily bread. Please notice it's our needs, not our greeds. And when we have a meal, Jesus is the prime example of this, Jesus always led in a prayer of gratitude to God for his provision. He's a providing, sustaining God. And that's not just a matter of habit or repeating some mindless mantra, it's recognizing our genuine gratitude to God, recognition that all such provision ultimately comes from God's generous bounty. Daily bread for all. Now that implies there must be a more equitable distribution of that provision. We're asking God for our daily bread, not just our personal daily bread, but for his continued generosity and provision for all. We live in a global marketplace, and our wealth contributes to the poverty of others. And notice my wording, contributes to, doesn't necessarily cause. Economists would wring their hands with such a suggestion. But our wealth can contribute to the poverty of others if we don't make responsible provision for the more equitable distribution of God's bounty for all people. Imagine this parable. A farmer asks his tenants to reap a harvest and gather the crops into big barns or silos in order to serve the entire community. And imagine that one or two wealthy individuals from within that community come along to the tenant and say, I want to buy the lot. They buy the entire contents of that silo. And having done so, they gorge themselves on that provision and then control the marketplace for the costs that make that provision available to the rest of the community. Now you might say that's too simplistic, but actually that's what happens in our world. And even if it sounds simplistic, to a malnourished person, that's exactly what the situation is. So God is a providing God. He provides for humanity, and we have a responsibility to ensure that all are cared for. So back to Genesis chapter 1, God says, I give you every green plant for food. He is a provider, sustainer God. Now for your reflection or discussion. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. In his person and by his words and deeds, he brings spiritual life. Our ministry is to the whole person, to feed the body as well as the spirit. And here's my question. How might we act to do that more effectively? Well, thank you for listening, and look out for the next in our series, Genesis, the first 3 chapters.